So good evening, everybody. As Ajahn Anando mentioned, I actually come from England, so that's my home country. I started at Abhayagiri Monastery, which is probably our largest Western monastery. That's just north of London in England. And I had the good fortune to spend quite a few years with Lompo Samedo. And Lompo Samedo will be coming here, I believe, in probably a week or 10 days to stay for a month. And he was very much an inspiration for me over the years. Initially, I couldn't really grasp his teachings. I thought that I felt that they were so direct. I just couldn't actually understand them. They were so to the point. He has this tendency of always aiming for the bullseye, as it were. And when I first came to Buddhism, it was a very rapid change in my life. So I actually started living in the monastery within about 2 weeks of meeting Buddhism. So I went on a meditation retreat at Abhayagiri and then went home and tidied up my life, as it were. And I left on the Sunday and I was back in the monastery on the Friday. So it was quite a rapid change. So I didn't really know anything about Buddhism, but I'd spent some time on this retreat and it was incredibly difficult. It was a lot of internal struggles, physical struggles. But I immediately felt a deep resonance with the Four Noble Truths. When I came across the Four Noble Truths, it felt like truth. It appeared as truth. But I didn't know what to do with those Four Noble Truths. But reflecting on my own life before meeting the Four Noble Truths, it was obvious that so much of my suffering was caused by my own behaviour, my own mental states, my own action. So with, my experience of Buddhism was quite minor, but there was this intuition, this sense of this is really important, it's something you shouldn't ignore. You should spend some time pursuing this. It was quite a drastic change because at that time I was engaged to get married and I was also running a small fitness company. So I went home on the Sunday and broke off the engagement, closed the business and went back on the Friday. So everyone was expecting me to get married and carry on as I was. But there was this radical change, so I upset a lot of people through that decision. But I'd been meditating for a couple of years and I'd been quite stressed out through running the business, and the meditation had become such a foundation of peace for me, a place to go when everything was, very intense externally. I'd spend a lot of time meditating every day, probably 3 hours a day. And that's quite a lot for, when you're working and busy. So, and even though I hadn't come across Buddhism, I had faith in meditation. So going to the monastery, into the retreat, full-on meditation. I hadn't actually experienced a retreat before, so I'd never actually been quiet and never stopped speaking. So it was a 10-day retreat, silent retreat. And it just exposed everything that was underneath the surface, all the suffering that was there, all the pain, the delusions. So by the end of the retreat, it wasn't through great bliss or great happiness in meditation. It was like a drawing away of a veil, and beneath that veil was just this realm of struggle, realm of depression, anxiety, misery. And the realization came that I just couldn't go back to the life I was living and just pretend that wasn't there. It wasn't actually happening. So this decision was, it was quite a radical or extreme way of approaching the situation. But I felt if I didn't do it immediately, I would be convinced by the people around me not to do it. So that was 28 years ago. And I was 28 at the time, so it's half my life now in the monastery. And the monastery is a great place to go through your suffering. It's a great place to understand suffering, to learn about it. In Luang Por Sumedho, I remember one particular quote quite early on in my time at Amaravati, and he said, "The monastery is here to make you suffer." I'm pretty sure he wasn't a sadist, but what he meant by that, it sort of contains us. It doesn't give us an opportunity to distract ourselves. If you come to a good monastery, you can't distract yourself. The only thing you can do is look at your mind. So this is a great gift. The monastery is a great gift for the world. It's a great opportunity. Even though many of us who come here, we know it's not going to be easy. We have enough worldly experience or meditative experience to understand that, giving our lives fully to this, it's a challenge, putting ourselves within a hierarchy where most of us would prefer not to be in a hierarchy. Most of us would prefer to lead ourselves, make our own decisions. But when you come into a training monastery like this, you have to give up so much preference. So all the monks, the Anagarikas, Samaneras here, they've given up choice, but for a purpose. So they've given up choosing what clothes they wear in the morning, giving up what hairstyle they have. They've given up sexual activity, given up money, given up going where they want to go, whenever they want to go, anywhere. And they've thrown themselves into a schedule. So the choice is, you don't have much choice, basically. You give up what food you eat and when you eat it. There is a little bit of wiggle room around some of these things, but not much. And what this does is, if you've lived a life like I was living, which was full of sensuality and pursuing all sorts of activities which I wanted to pursue, and then you come to the monastery and suddenly you can't pursue anything, there's a reaction. It's like going cold turkey off a drug. Withdrawal symptoms. So a lot of the early years in the monastery are bearing with unfulfilled desire. There's a lot of craving for food, for sex, for whatever else, movies, TV, alcohol, intimacy. And the only thing you get is food. So a lot of the desire, as you've probably noticed, circles around food. I remember my time as an Anagarika at Chithurst Monastery, which is once again quite it's a training monastery. And some days I'd be craving food so much, I'd finish my food so quickly, and I'd return to the kitchen, grab a tray of cakes and disappear into the larder and just have a cake frenzy for about 15 minutes. It didn't solve any problems at the time. But, it did relieve a bit of the stress for a few seconds. But that's the only outlet, it's food really, which is, I suppose it's the way it's supposed to be. But the container gives us this opportunity to observe what's going on, just to stop and observe and not follow every whim that rises into consciousness. Mindfulness is pushed in all our monasteries. It's very much a catchphrase or an overused word in the world nowadays. But it's really important, being aware of what's happening and not following it. Not following our desires, not following our tendencies, our habit patterns. So even in a beautiful place like this, a monastery, this is an ideal forest monastery. It's set up to the ideal. Beautiful nature, kutis in the forest. It's pretty much finished. Lots of, there's a wonderful library, Dhamma hall, eating hall, separate kitchen. You can't really get much better than this in terms of a monastery on a physical level. But still, we all suffer. We come into the monastery and we can feel like our suffering is actually increasing because of this cold turkey or withdrawal symptoms. I remember my first 5 years in the monastery, it was like a living hell. And then it improved a little bit after 5 years. So it's only about 90% suffering after 5 years. And then after 8 years, it went down to about 80. And then after 12 years, it improved a bit more. So it does take a lot of patient endurance. It's not something that's won easily. Well, it wasn't for me anyway. I mean, there are a few of those who are very gifted, and their kilesas, their habitual tendencies are quite minimal, but mine seemed to be quite strong. So there was a lot of patience involved. Just bearing with uncomfortable feelings, and having a wild mind. I had this image arise when I was sort of anagarika or a samanera, I can't remember which, but it was like a metaphor for what was happening inside me, inside my mind. It was like, when you have a sitting room or a lounge and you've got your television, you've got the sofa and all the ornaments around the lounge. And it was like having a rhino in the lounge with you, and you're trying to watch the television, and every time it turns around, it smashes up the furniture. It was like that. It was just this wild beast inside me that I was trying to sort of rein in. So maybe some of you have experienced this, and maybe it's been easier. I hope it has been easier. But gradually over time, things improve, The mind settles down. You learn skills. There's many skills we need to develop, for understanding ourselves, understanding the mind, and learning how to work with different defilements, learning how to undermine our habitual tendencies, and to develop skillful tendencies, skillful mind states. But ultimately what's with us all the time is the awareness itself. It's the background. It's that which knows what's going on. And ultimately, it's the refuge that we're looking for, this pure awareness. Most people in the world, they don't even know that they're conscious most of the time. They're so wrapped up with the objects of consciousness. So sight, sound, smells, tastes, tactile impressions and mental activity. This is all most people know. They don't have a perspective on it. They don't have any space around it. So they're completely lost in them, all of these objects of consciousness. So when they arise, they just follow them. They follow desires for pleasure and trying to get away from pain. And this is quite normal. There's nothing wrong with this. But for us to really make some powerful progress in this practice, we need to understand awareness and start seeing what it is, what its capabilities are, and start trusting it. In some respects, awareness is what we really are. Not in terms of a personality. We can make a self out of awareness if we want to. But just like the body, there's no self there. Selfing, if you like, is an activity that we do. We create a self. It's a habit, just like everything else. And the self is, once again, it's an object of consciousness. So getting a perspective on self, it's just thoughts, it's just emotions, it's just sensations, it's just clinging. But we believe it's real. It's something that's true and real, and we are this individual self. So using awareness to get a perspective on self, on the objects of consciousness, is really, really important. So right now, can the sensations in your body know consciousness? Can your thoughts know consciousness? Can your emotions know consciousness? No. But consciousness can know these things. Consciousness knows thinking. Consciousness knows emotions and sensations. So thoughts aren't who and what we are. They're just objects of consciousness arising and passing away. The same with emotions, and same with thought, same with sensations in the body. They come into consciousness, they're there for a while and then they've gone. But if we grasp them and believe in them, then we get lost in them. So one of the most difficult things that people experience is the thinking mind. It speaks with our voice in our heads and tells us we are who we are. So to develop the skill to let go of thinking, this is really important. Like Luang Por Sumedho talks about this a lot. He uses the body and the sound of silence to open the awareness. Because obsessive thinking is like a contracted state. So when we have a thought arise in consciousness and we grasp hold of that thought, and then we start proliferating around that thought, we start thinking more basically, then consciousness starts to close around that. And then we have this constricted or contracted state. And most of our thinking is fueled by emotion. So emotion comes up, and generally negative emotions we don't like. So we push those away, we suppress those, And then that emotion plays itself out in consciousness as thinking. So we think we're actually thinking, but those emotions are fueling those thoughts. So it's not us, it's the emotions below the surface that are fueling those thoughts. And then we have what's known as a negative feedback loop. So we have emotions that we suppress, and then the thinking comes into consciousness, which is related to those emotions. So we think negatively, and those negative thoughts stir up more negative emotions that we suppress again. And then we have the negative thoughts, and it just loops around. And this is what happens to someone who gets caught up in obsessive thinking. We become victims of thinking. So most of us, I'm sure, have lain awake at night on our beds and been unable to switch off the thinking mind. It just loops around and we can't sleep. This is common nowadays because we're overstimulated and we haven't learnt the skills necessary to be able to put down thinking. So it's really important in our practice to be able to break this pattern. So there's a couple of ways to do it. One is to pay attention to an object, either the breath or the body or sound of silence, and just give ourselves to that. And this helps to reduce the thinking. So we just feel instead of thinking. It's just feeling instead of thinking. Feeling life instead of thinking life. And this is a good motto, whatever. But sometimes we can't do it because the habit is so strong. We can't let go of the thinking. We can't slow it down. So then the Buddha recommends what is known as substitution. So he gives a metaphor for this. It's like when there's a wooden peg in a wooden hole. We take a second wooden peg and a mallet and we tap the second wooden peg into the first wooden peg, and the first wooden peg drops out. So we're replacing one peg with another. So this is what we do with thinking. If we can't stop thinking, we actually use thinking to overcome thinking. So we're highly conditioned beings. We may think that we're special and we're not conditioned like everybody else, but I can assure you that you are. We're all like computers. We've just been programmed to think in the way we do. By the society we've grown up in, we get a language that's fed into us. We get our schooling conditioning, the views and opinions of society. We're conditioned by those, and we're conditioned by all the things we take in. And very rarely do we have original thought. We just tend to regurgitate what we've learnt. And this might be insulting to some of you, but if you really contemplate, you'll see that most of the stuff that you've actually come up with yourselves comes from somewhere else or somebody else. We've learnt pretty much everything from outside. So we've been conditioned, we've been programmed by the societies that we live in. So in a way, we're reconditioning ourselves. So this substitution, if you like, you're putting positive thoughts, positive affirmation into the mind. And this is intentional thinking. So the other is habitual thinking. And intentional thinking is always more powerful than habitual thinking. But habitual thinking has been there for longer. So it will try to maintain itself. It will return, even though we use intentional thinking. We have to persevere with it. So using a positive affirmation, say for instance, if there's anxiety underneath the surface and you're thinking anxious thoughts, one needs to use something that will mollify or gentle the anxiety that's beneath the thinking as well as the thinking itself. So a phrase or just one word if you like, just to help us settle, to help that thinking, that negative thinking to actually start to die away and the emotions to calm down. So most people in the world, all they do is think about the future and think out how unsatisfying the present is. So they're seeking the future all the time. There's very little energy given to the present. You know, most of the time they can be thinking about what's happened in the past, bringing that up into consciousness, and then projecting into the future possibilities, hopes and fears of what's going to happen in the future. And in a way, the present is just an obstacle to getting what they want. But you might not have noticed, or you might have, that the present is all there is. Past and future don't really exist. So you'll notice this if you do let go of thinking, without thinking, there's no past and future. You have to create past and future by thinking. That's the only way to do it. So gradually, by calming this thinking down and just getting into the body with the breath or whatever, or just feeling the body itself, what you're doing then is you're actually creating a foundation, if you like, for awareness. So when all the energy's up in the head, we're thinking a lot, it's like an inverted pyramid. So it's a pyramid standing on its point. So it's incredibly unstable, that pyramid. And people who just think all the time are incredibly unstable because they can't control anything. They're just victims of their emotions and their thoughts. So what you're doing by putting your awareness into the body, is flipping that pyramid the other way up. So you have a really stable foundation. Now it's really difficult to tip a pyramid over because the base is so broad and the top is so narrow. But there's still a peak, there's still a pinnacle, there's still, our thinking is a wonderful skill or an ability that we have as human beings. But we want it to be used like a tool that we pick up and put down when we need to. So it's like something in your toolkit. It's another skill that you use when you need to, rather than something that harasses us or overwhelms us. So using these two methods, even together, so feeling the body, feeling the breath, and using a positive affirmation, something like trust or everything's going to be fine, or, just metta practice is another thing. Using thought skillfully to actually lessen thinking, to soften thinking. So as I said, most people in the world ignore the present, but the present is our home. Can you get out of the present? Is it ever not now? Can you get into the past or the future? Can you experience the past or the future? All you can do is think about it. So the present is our home. And if we're always trying to get rid of the present and get something better, that creates incredible tension. Like we're averse to the present. We don't like it because that's where all the emotions live. Especially the unpleasant ones, because we're projecting pleasant ones into the future. So we're grasping onto the future and trying to get away from the present. And this creates tension. So in a nutshell, this is the Four Noble Truths. It's like when we hold on to something, if you look at my hand, when you hold on to something, you do what we call clinging. So we cling, we hold on. Now just imagine holding a tennis ball, not with too much tension, but you're just holding it, you're just pressing on it. And that's fine for about, maybe a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Maybe it starts to ache a bit after, say, 15 minutes. What about 20 minutes? What about an hour, 5 hours, a day, a month, a year, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? Clinging is like that, and most people are clinging all the time. So they're in pain all the time. So the unpleasant sensations that they're feeling are in the present, so they want to get away from them, but they're just creating another negative feedback loop by being averse to the present and trying to get something better. They're making it worse and worse and worse through that activity. So what we have to do is come into the present, embrace the present, feel the present. Like the Four Noble Truths tell us to do, there is suffering. Suffering has to be understood. By that, the Buddha means we have to turn into it, not away from it. We have to study it. We have to experience it. We have to know it, embrace it. And by doing that, you're embracing the present as well, your home, our home. So when we embrace the present, a huge amount of suffering drops away because our thinking greatly reduces. So the more you give yourself to the body, the more you give yourselves to the present and let go of past and future, so much of the thinking is about past and future. Obviously, we have to plan, we have to make plans. But if you just pick your tool of thinking up and use it for, say, 10, 15 minutes, then you put it down again, you make your plans. But then you let go of it. You leave it alone. And you will find if you can let go of thinking, sound of silence is really good because that opens all of this area up here. There's just all this contraction around the jaw, the neck. Thinking's behind, most of it happens, obsessive thinking, behind your eyes. And the forehead scrunches up. All the senses are up here as well, most of them. Sensual activities up here. So most of our time, if we're not aware, is spent in our heads. So getting out of the head into the body, open the awareness. The awareness, like right now, you can put your awareness on your big toe. So you can focus it. Or you can open it up and experience the whole room. It's not a fixed entity. It's not even an entity. So awareness is our home. So we need to make our home a nice place to live. But if we haven't cleaned out our home for 20, 30, 40 years, it's going to be a bit smelly and messy and dirty. So most of us have a bit of housework to do. So all these suppressed, repressed emotions will start coming up. So if you feel like you've been in the monastery a year and you're worse than you were when you arrived, it's not necessarily the case. It's just, it's a messy business cleaning up. It's not very nice having to do it. And sometimes it can be painful and unpleasant. But some people don't have much to clean out. And some people have a huge amount. But these early stages are, they're really important as well, because this is where you study the 5 hindrances. You see what's going on. There's all the craving, the aversion, the anxiety, the doubt, the sleepiness. This is where we learn about the 5 hindrances and how they block us from seeing the truth. I spent the first 5 years just looking at the 5 hindrances. That's all I did because that's all I had. There wasn't much sunlight, it was just clouds. So what do you do when you've got clouds? You study the clouds. Because that's still consciousness knowing the objects. It's just not very comfortable. But gradually over time, the clouds start to clear and the sun comes through. And you start to experience some warmth, some happiness, some peace, some joy. Now, of course, this is my experience, I'm sure it doesn't have to be like that. Because I was lacking in wisdom. If you've got some wisdom, you can break through a bit quicker. But it just took me a long time to see the truth, to have some insights. But this clinging, this grasping, if we don't let go of it, we're going to be suffering forever. Some people say that one day every blade of grass will be free. This is very idealistic. If we believe that, I think, we could be going around this samsara for many, many lifetimes. We really have to put effort in to understand, to see, to realise. We have to put effort into our practice. Practice. Because we do see the fruits. We do see changes, normally not as quickly as we'd like. That's understandable. But it does happen. Even after the first 5 years, when it was still really difficult, I could see there was progression, there was change. There was understanding, there was growth. And this is what gives us faith to continue. We can actually see the results. We can see ourselves growing. We can see understanding deepening. So insight's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. So when you have an insight, it's like one piece of a jigsaw. You put it down in the centre of a puzzle, and you look down and you've got a picture, but it's not a complete picture, and maybe you don't even know what it is, but there is something there. And as your practice continues, you have another insight, and you put it down next to the first one, and it grows a bit bigger, the picture, and it actually changes your understanding of the first insight. It doesn't mean the first insight is no longer valid. It just means it's fleshed out, it's given more detail. And then the third insight comes, and the fourth insight. And once again, they flesh out and change your understanding as it grows, the picture grows. And these little insights, they keep coming. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they all go in, they create a picture. And every so often, you have a deeper insight. So they all come together. They all link up. The first 10 insights, they link up to each other. And you realise the whole picture's upside down. And you turn it the right way up. But you can never know when these insights are going to come. You can't force it. You can't make it happen. But you can be diligent in your practice. You can give yourselves to the meditation. It's not an easy life being a Buddhist monk or a Buddhist nun. There is a lot of difficulties to go through, a lot of suffering, a lot of challenges. But the Buddha, he gives us the encouragement. He says it's, there is the suffering that leads to more suffering, and there's the suffering that leads to the end of suffering. So he recommends that we follow this path that he laid out before us, the Eightfold Path, and he informs us that this is the path that leads to the end of suffering. And all we have to do is follow it. Give ourselves to it. Now I'm still learning and still growing. I hope I am growing anyway. It's been a long road, but I would have never have learnt the things I've learnt living in any other way. The meditation times, the retreats, the challenges, just bearing with them and not running away from them. This is what helps us grow. If we're always running from our emotions, our difficulties, they will pursue us. We cannot get away from them. We have to turn into our demons and embrace them and see that they're not really demons after all. The hindrances, we have to understand them. We have to embrace them. We have to give them room to be what they are. But not get lost in them, not get caught up in them, not get drawn around by them. They are what they are, they're just objects of consciousness. So all these things that come up, when we take this stand, take the stand, or take our stand with consciousness itself. Everything that comes into consciousness is a thing. And all things are impermanent. So they come in, they stay for a while, and then they've gone. So everything's like that. But consciousness is not a thing. It's that which knows things. And consciousness can only function in the present, as I said. And it watches everything go through it. So even time goes through consciousness. Consciousness doesn't move anywhere, doesn't go anywhere. So days and nights pass through consciousness. Years pass through consciousness. But consciousness just stays where it is. So reflecting on this, it can give us deep insight that really can take us. For myself, this was one of the deepest insights, was around timelessness. And it reduced a lot of suffering. So taking this refuge in consciousness, it really is a refuge. Awareness, consciousness, same thing. And the more we trust in it, the more we let go of the hindrances, the obstacles. We leave them alone, the emotions, the thoughts. So I've gone on a bit this evening. I've rambled away, and maybe that's a good spot to finish in.